I'm Barry Bailey, and I want to tell you how much I enjoy getting to visit with you like this. The last tape that I made, I was talking about the life of Jesus. So I'm going to make a real change here and go into what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and start with the story of Adam and Eve, dealing with the book of Genesis. And before I get into this, you realize that the book of Genesis was carried as an oral history for a long time before it was ever written. They estimate that it was probably written about 500 years before the birth of Jesus. And today you may read about that. It will not deal with the idea of AD and BC. Often they'll have the letters D and CE there, meaning common era. They'll have BCE before the common era, and the common era is at the birth of Jesus. But at any rate, these stories were told for a long period of time. And somewhere, perhaps around 500 years before the birth of Jesus, they were put into a written form. And we have that, of course, as the book of Genesis. It starts by saying, in the beginning, God. There's no argument for God. It's just the fact that God is there. And you start with this. There's no proof of God. There's no disproof of God. In the beginning, God. And then there is this marvelous story. Now, these stories are not factual. They are thought of often as myths. At least that's the way I look at it. But that doesn't mean that it's a made-up story. A myth is a story that's not factual, but it has an enlarged truth to it. The truth is trying to answer questions that deal with issues in your own life to guide you in various directions. So at any rate, the questions were asked, where did we come from? And so it says, in the beginning, God. And then out of the very atmosphere almost, the creation, water and land, fish and animals, and here they are. And then there's the man and the woman, the creation of Adam and Eve. And they're in the garden. And they have everything they can desire. It's a delightful place to be. It's a utopia. It's the oasis in an area where you can just thrive and you can be there. And in the very process of being there was a statement saying, do whatever you want. You have the full sway of the garden, but don't eat of this particular tree. Now, interestingly, we call it an apple tree. The word apple does not appear there, certainly in the statements that you and I would be reading, the King James Version or whatever. It just says a tree. Isn't it interesting that when you're told not to do something, that's the one thing you want to do? In this marvelous book dealing with the little children where they're told, whatever you do, don't put beans up your nose, and as soon as the mother leaves, that's the one thing they do. There's something about a challenge when you're told not to do it. So they eat of the fruit of this tree. And the idea is they're accused of trying to be like God. That's just a statement that's thrown in there. They break a law. They eat of the fruit. Whether it's bad or good, maybe you've committed something that's really wrong, maybe it's something very minor. Once guilt takes over, your whole life changes. Adam feels guilty. Guilt is not what's on the outside, it's what's on the inside, and so Adam tries to hide from himself. Do you realize how ridiculous that is? If I'm guilty about something, I want to get away from whom I am. I want to get away from myself. That's the one thing I can't do. I can take a trip and pack everything else, but I'm going to pack myself too. Adam tries to hide. There's nowhere to hide. He's stuck. He did something he wishes he hadn't done. We associate it with the idea of sex, that they put these fig leaves on themselves. So they've had sex and they feel guilty about it. That's just a story that just sort of floats with a rumor. At any rate, he feels guilty, and so he says, God, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm trying to hide. And you find me, and he blames it on Eve. And Eve feels guilty, and she blames it on a snake. And this answers a question. Why do men have to work so hard? And the answer is, the original sin of Adam. Because he ate of the tree of life, he committed an original sin. So he's cursed by God. He has to work and make his living by the sweat of his brow. And why does a woman have to suffer giving childbirth? This answers it. Because she sinned and God's punishing her. And so when she has sex and gives birth to a child, it's a painful thing. And why does the snake crawl on its belly? The same reason. Eve blames the snake. Eve said, I didn't do it. The snake made me do it. I've said before, everyone needs a snake around the house once in a while just to blame. So here you have a man having to work hard, a woman giving childbirth, and a snake on its belly, answering questions because they sinned. This is the idea that's in the book, trying to explain to us why we are like we are. This is a myth that is carried. I don't think there's anything particularly original about sin. It's just a part of our lives. It's ubiquitous. It's always there. At any rate, we feel guilty, we do things wrong. Oddly enough, a lot of times you do things wrong, you don't feel guilty at all. And sometimes you feel guilty about something that's absolutely ridiculous you shouldn't. Sometimes you feel guilty about going against the tide when you ought to go against the tide because it's going the wrong way. At any rate, guilt is a part of our nature, and that deals with this. And then there's the birth of the two sons, Cain and Abel. And so these are the four people supposedly on the face of the earth. They're representing humanity. They came when Cain and Abel decided to make an offering to God. And so they go through this process of each bringing something that was important to him to offer to God to try to get God's favor. You and I do that. You pray, you tithe, you do a lot of good things. Often we're working trying to activate God or to get God to be nicer to us or to get God off our back. And we do various things that are important to us in the process. Here these two brothers make offerings to God. And Cain makes an offering that is not very representative of what he has. It's something less than what he ought to give. He's cheating himself. And Abel brings something that really represents a sacrifice. And then Cain looks at it and said, God, though he doesn't use the word God, he's thinking here of Yahweh, Jehovah, accepts his gift more than he does mine, and he hates his brother. When someone shows you up, you don't feel too good about that, do you? You don't despise yourself, simply you've got to get rid of the person that's worrying you. And that's what Cain decides to do. I made an offering, my brother makes an offering, his offering is more acceptable than mine. What am I going to do? So Cain kills Abel. One of the interesting things about this is the Bible is a book of religion, about religion, and it keeps this story here. The first murder was committed related to religion. Isn't that interesting? They could have left this out, but they didn't. They told the story, doubtlessly across time, and then finally have it written. Religion's important to you and me. We are instinctively religious. But I would imagine you'd be hard-pressed to prove that religion is always good. Religion can be so destructive. On the one hand, to kick it out the door, it's not always bad, is it? But you can't say it's good or bad. You have to look at how it's used. How many wars are fought over religion? Time and again, people quote God to allow them to do something wrong. People get converted, and out of being converted and getting better, they say, it lets them do horrible things. The people we execute here in the state of Texas in Huntsville because they've committed murder. How many good Christians are in favor of the death penalty? Isn't that odd? You're against someone because he committed murder, and now you're in favor of getting rid of him, though you call it an execution, because he deserves it. And you say it from the standpoint because you're good enough to judge him. Isn't it odd how we can get like Cain and we don't realize it's happening to us? These stories are timeless. One of the marvelous things about truth is that it transcends time. An event is in time. Truth moves above the event. It doesn't have to be a fact, but it can find a place to lodge in every generation. What this story is saying is, over this religious act, the first murder was committed. Isn't that interesting?